April 25, 1945. 28,000 feet above the fractured fields of southern Bavaria. The sky was bone-white and whisper-thin at that altitude. Contrails smeared like chalk lines across a frozen canvas. It was the hour just before the sun took over from the cold, when shadows still stretched long across the mountains, and frost hung inside cockpit glass like static ghosts. In the center of it all, one P-51 Mustang, alone. Silver-skinned, stripped of its wing tanks, the aircraft shook with the pressure of what it wasn't designed to do. The prop spun at redline. The Merlin engine wailed like it was trying to claw its way out of the fuselage. The plane wasn't flying, it was barely holding together. Behind it, 5 Me-262s fanned into pursuit. German jets, 4-engine killers. The future of war. Streamlined, twin-engined, turbine-powered nightmares. They could climb faster, dive harder, and cruise at speeds no piston plane could touch. By every law of flight, this was already over. And yet, the Mustang didn't die. In the cockpit, Captain Rex Branson leaned forward like he was dragging the plane with his spine. His oxygen mask hissed rhythmically. Sweat rolled into his collar despite the sub-zero air. Every 5 seconds he tapped the boost gauge, 80 inches. Not a reading. A warning. No Packard Merlin was supposed to push that hard for this long. But he had no choice. Because this wasn't just a chase. It was proof. Proof that what they'd laughed at on the ground, what they'd called a Frankenstein turbo, the scrapyard special, Branson's suicide pipe, was doing the impossible. 1 week earlier, in a maintenance tent behind a muddy French airfield, Branson's crew chief, Sergeant Malley, had dragged a cracked turbo assembly from a pile of bomber wreckage. It had no housing cover. The fins were half melted. It was designed for a B-24 Liberator, not a single-seat fighter. But Malley had stared at it like it owed him something. He didn't just bolt it on, he fused it, rigged a custom manifold, rerouted the exhaust loop, stripped the cowling, and rewired the boost line through a pressure valve stolen from a P-38 parts kit. Everyone thought he'd lost it. "This isn't engineering," one officer scoffed. "It's a war crime." But Branson agreed to test it, not out of bravery, but because the Luftwaffe jets were tearing holes through recon squadrons daily. On his last mission, 3 of 5 Mustangs in his group were lost before reaching the target. The Me-262s didn't just attack, they danced, in and out, gone before the guns could lock. So he made a bet, 1 Mustang, 1 boost-broken engine, 1 chance to escape the math. And now, over Bavaria, it was happening. The jets behind him began to spread. 1 overshot. Another rolled to bracket him from above, too slow. Branson kicked left, then hard right, dove into the haze and flattened out at 25,000 feet. His airspeed was peaking. Turbine howled behind him but not closing. He wasn't faster, but he was already moving, and they couldn't catch what they couldn't predict. On the ground later, the Me-262 squadron filed confused reports. Target turned at impossible speed. Possible second aircraft? Visual lost in altitude haze. No one confirmed the kill. But they all agreed it wasn't a normal Mustang. Branson landed with smoke trailing from his engine vents. The turbo was cracked through, cooling system scorched, left wing strut warped from the G-forces. As he stepped down from the plane, the base chaplain said quietly, "You outran the devil." Branson just looked back at the smoking Mustang and muttered, "No, I just tricked him into turning late." 5 days before the chase. April 20th, 1945. A cold wind crawled across a makeshift Allied forward airfield in France. The ground was half frozen mud and gravel. Mechanics wore 2 sets of gloves, not for protection, but because they kept burning holes in the first pair. And in the middle of it all stood a silver Mustang with its guts torn out. Captain Rex Branson squinted against the wind as Sergeant Malley barked orders through a wrench between his teeth. Spread across the tarp were parts that did not belong. A half-melted turbo assembly from a crashed B-24, sections of manifold tubing, and a patched radiator scoop cannibalized from a P-38 Lightning. The setup looked like an engine from a horror movie. Hoses twisted at wrong angles, fittings held by prayers and brass wire. 3 other pilots passed by and stared. One muttered, "What the hell is that supposed to be?" Another answered, "A flying warranty violation." They weren't wrong. Malley had been toying with the idea for months. Everyone knew the Merlin engine in the P-51 was good, maybe even great. But above 25,000 feet, it began to lose its teeth. The Germans had figured it out. Me-262s danced above the ceiling, picking off bombers and vanishing before Mustangs could even climb. What Malley knew, what he had been reading from a stack of engineering bulletins no one else bothered with, was that the turbo systems in the B-24s were overbuilt, underused, and sometimes dumped in crash yards half intact. So he found one, rebuilt it, and convinced Branson to try it. The first time they fired it up, the exhaust stack flashed blue. The intake shuddered. The turbo whined like a banshee and blew out a back panel. Everyone ran, everyone but Malley. He was laughing. "This'll work," he said, tightening a hose clamp with grease up to his elbow, "or it'll take us both to Berlin in flaming pieces." The officers weren't amused. Captain Doyle filed a formal complaint, said the modification was reckless, unauthorized, and potentially compromising to the airframe. The CO, Colonel Harbaugh, agreed. Mostly. But he also needed eyes over the Rhine. So he gave Branson a nod and a warning. 1 test flight, that's it. Branson took it up at dawn. The engine roared. It didn't just climb, it clawed. The plane screamed past 30,000 feet, like it had been unchained. Fuel burn was atrocious. Temperature limits were exceeded. The manifold buzzed like it wanted to explode. But the Mustang did something it had never done before. It outran its own shadow. When he landed, the brakes smoked. The prop spun down like it was sighing in relief. Branson climbed out, face pale, and simply said, "You built a monster." Malley just grinned. "Good. Now let's teach it to bite." Word spread fast. Within hours, the flight line was full of jokes. "Branson's got a secret jet. Don't get too close, it might infect your plane. You hear the turbo screams in your sleep." But none of them volunteered to fly it. Not until the 262s came back. Not until recon birds stopped returning. Not until desperation made everyone forget the punchlines. Because in war, one laugh is always followed by a silence. The P-51 Mustang is a legend, but legends, like machines, have limits. On paper, the Mustang was everything an Allied pilot could want. Long range, sleek, deadly in the right hands. It had a bubble canopy for visibility, a 50 cal bite, and a Packard-built Merlin engine. A British-American hybrid that defined high-altitude air superiority in 1944. But 1945 wasn't 1944. The enemy had changed, and the Mustang, for all its glory, was being outclassed, not by numbers, but by speed. The Me-262 had arrived. The German jet was terrifying on multiple levels. Its 2 Junkers Jumo 04 turbojets gave it a top speed over 540 mph, nearly 120 mph faster than a stock P-51D at optimal altitude. It could climb like a missile, accelerate out of danger, and strike with 4 30mm cannons that didn't need a second pass. The Mustang couldn't compete in straight-line pursuit, not even close. Its top speed, 437 mph at 25,000 feet, was respectable but static. The second the Me-262 throttled up, the P-51 had 2 choices: dive and disengage, or hope the jet made a mistake. In theory, the Mustang had better low-speed maneuverability and turn radius. In theory, it could out-dogfight a jet in a turning battle. But that was a fantasy. Me-262s didn't dogfight, they ambushed. Worse, radar coverage was inconsistent. Ground intercept stations couldn't track jets reliably at speed. Visual confirmation often came too late. Entire bomber squadrons were getting clipped by attackers that were invisible until it was already over. Allied planners knew this. That's why in early 1945 they began quietly funding experimental mods, engine overboost trials, lightweight stripped variants, even early talks of retrofitting jets onto standard frames. But none of it was fast enough. Factories were behind, pilots were dying, and the war's final battles would be decided before theory reached the runway. Enter the field mods, unofficial, unsanctioned, and dangerous. Mechanics in France, Belgium, even Western Germany began experimenting, not by design, but by necessity. Some added fuel line pressurizers, others cut weight by stripping armor plating. A few, like Malley, looked at bomber parts and thought, why not? The turbocharged Merlin engine was never meant to be force-fed like a bomber, but under the right hands, for a short burst, it could handle the pressure. Not forever, not for long, but long enough. Branson's modded Mustang pushed 470 to 480 ampere in controlled dive, not enough to outrun a Me-262 forever, but enough to close the gap in surprise, enough to disrupt a pursuit, enough to make a jet hesitate, and hesitation kills. But the cost was steep. Fuel consumption tripled, overboost shredded turbine blades. Cooling systems cracked. The modified P-51 could only fly 1 or 2 missions before its engine became a ticking bomb, and its flight profile became unstable past 32,000 feet. It could go there, but it couldn't stay. The irony? It worked. Not because it was better, but because it dared to be worse in all the right ways. Unstable, unpredictable, unreadable on radar, and flown by a man willing to burn through his wings to get a shot. That was the line between myth and madness. And in April 1945, that line was all that stood between life and being another name on a crash log. In war, numbers don't lie, but they can mislead. Start with this, the Me-262, first operational jet fighter in history. Twin Junkers Jumo 004 engines. Top speed, 540 miles per hour in level flight. Climb rate, 3,900 feet per minute. Service ceiling, 38,000 feet. 4 Mk-108 cannons in the nose, each firing 30mm rounds at 650 RPM. Now compare that to the Mustang. The P-51D could push 437 mph at 25,000 feet. That was with perfect fuel mix, optimal temperature, and minimal drag. It climbed at 3,200 feet per minute, strong, but not supersonic. And at high altitudes, the engine began to labor. Thin air, high stress, marginal returns. On paper, the fight was already lost. But war doesn't happen on paper. It happens in turbulence. When Branson's crew began tuning the Junkyard turbo, they weren't trying to make the Mustang better than the Me-262. They were trying to make it just dangerous enough to matter. Let's run the modified math. With the B-24 turbo mod, intake pressure rose dramatically. Fuel flow surged. For roughly 3 minutes at full throttle before meltdown, the Merlin engine could spike to 480 mph. Some field logs claim 490. But even Branson called those ghost numbers. Still, 480 meant something critical. It put him in reach. Because the Me-262 wasn't always flying at 540. It needed space to accelerate. It bled speed in turns. And crucially, it lost thrust at low altitudes. A Mustang pushing 480 in a dive could intercept or escape. If the German pilot hesitated, missed his throttle window, or overbanked, the kill gap collapsed. Here's another number that mattered. Visibility time. In late-war Germany, Allied recon teams calculated the average time from radar contact to first visual was 14 seconds. At closing speeds of 800+ mph, that gave pilots a 5 to 7 second window to maneuver or fire. Too slow to aim, too fast to adjust, unless you were already turning. Already pulling Gs, already ready. Branson's plane didn't just cheat the speed stat. It cheated timing. There's more. Fuel. The Me-262 guzzled high-grade jet fuel, something the collapsing Reich couldn't provide at scale. Most squadrons were flying at 60% capacity by April 45. Each jet had about 30-35 minutes in the air, depending on throttle discipline. After that, they were gliders. The Mustang ran on avgas. Reliable. Abundant. Branson had a full tank and custom-cut reserves. He could fly 3 times longer than his pursuers, if he survived the first 10 minutes. And then there's weight. Branson's plane had been stripped. No wing tanks, no extra ammo, armor plate removed. Every ounce gone, except the turbo. The power-to-weight ratio was brutal. One mechanic called it a hot rod with a death wish. But it meant his plane moved. It shook. It screamed. But it moved. The final stat that mattered? 1. That's how many Mustangs were modified this way. 1 mechanic, 1 pilot, 1 turbo, 1 flight profile that worked once and could never be done again. But in that moment, those numbers did something no doctrine could. They made 5 jet pilots miss their shot. They made command rethink what was possible. They made a myth, built from scrap. April 25, 1945. 0642 hours. Call sign, Silver 9. Altitude 26,000 feet. Location, somewhere above central Bavaria. The morning was quiet. Too quiet for April. The sky was clear, glassy with a chill that crept through cockpit seams and into the bones. Branson's breath frosted against his mask, each inhale a warning. He was flying alone, assigned to escort a photo recon Lightning that had turned back early due to engine trouble. Now it was just him, the sky and static in his headset. He didn't expect contact, but war doesn't ask for expectations. At 0643, he caught the first glint, a shimmer at the far edge of the horizon. Too fast for propeller blur, too level for flak burst, then another and another. 5 specks, tight formation, gliding in on an intercept vector, Me-262s. Instincts flared before systems did. No radar pings, no ground warnings, just speed, just motion, just Branson's eyes confirming what his gut already knew. They were coming for him. He pulled back on the stick, leveled off at 28,000, and reached under the panel, flipped the secondary fuel mix, adjusted the turbo spool valve Malley had rigged 3 days earlier. The Mustang growled. The turbo began to sing, that unholy, whistling scream like a banshee throttled through a pipe organ. This was it. Not theory, not test, not wrench turns in a tent. This was the moment everything would snap, or soar. At 0644, the lead Me-262 broke formation, angling into attack position. It was close enough now for Branson to see the shape of its nose cannons, 4 of them, silent but hungry. Branson didn't wait. He dove, nose down, full throttle, radiator shutters closed, overboost on. The Mustang howled, the turbo wailed, the frame shook so hard he thought the wings might shear. The altimeter spun backwards like a broken clock. 27,000. 26. 25. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The only thing that mattered now was angle, airspeed, and inertia. At this rate, he'd be pushing 490 mph within seconds, possibly more. Far beyond what the P-51D was ever rated for. But if he didn't, he was already dead. The jets followed, but something strange happened. They didn't close. One 262 tried to descend directly but overshot. Another banked to match but couldn't hold angle. Its jet wash peeled sideways in the thinner air. The Mustang wasn't faster, but it had started sooner. Its dive vector was too steep, too sudden, too unstable for the jets to adjust. They had the power. He had the timing. 0646. Branson flattened out at 22,000 feet, cut throttle briefly, flipped the intercooler fan to emergency mode. The cabin stank of hot metal and ionized air. A thin trail of smoke was forming near the turbo mount, but the engine kept screaming. Now came the turn. He rolled left, sharp, almost vertical, then right, a jinking move that threw the interceptors offline. The Me-262s couldn't follow, not at those speeds. Their engines flared with delay. The famous flaw of jet propulsion, spool lag. Branson's timing had hit the window. One jet broke off, another clipped turbulence and leveled out, losing pursuit. By 0648, Branson was alone again. He didn't climb. He didn't turn back. He just flew, low, fast, straight west. When he landed, the Mustang hissed like a pressure cooker. The cowling was scorched. The left landing gear nearly collapsed. The turbo had melted through 2 bolts and cracked the firewall. The canopy wouldn't open at first. Branson had to kick it with his boot. Base crews gathered in silence. One pilot said, "How fast were you going?" Branson didn't answer. He looked at the plane, at the burnt paint, the heat lines on the fuselage, and said, "Fast enough they didn't laugh." Later, command wrote it up as evasive action, successful. No kills, no medals, just one pilot who refused to die, and 5 jets that couldn't catch him. The Mustang rolled to a stop, one wheel locked. The engine coughed smoke. Ground crew rushed forward but held short, unsure if the plane would explode or simply fall apart. Sergeant Malley, red-eyed and oil-stained, stood behind the cordon gripping a clipboard, not to check stats, but to steady his hands. Branson climbed down slowly, face pale, suit soaked in sweat despite sub-zero altitude just minutes before. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone saw it. The plane had survived, barely. Later that afternoon, the teardown began. Mechanics peeled back panels like surgeons on a trauma table. What they found confirmed what the numbers already whispered. This was a one-time trick. The turbo assembly, the heart of the Junkyard mod, was scorched. The exhaust flange was split. Welds around the manifold had begun to peel under pressure. The intercooler duct was blistered. One fuel injector had cracked mid-flight and rerouted a pressure stream dangerously close to the electrical bus. They were seconds from catastrophic failure. Even Malley, the inventor, stood silent for a full minute after reading the pressure log. "This bird," he finally muttered, "didn't fly. It screamed for help the whole way." And it wasn't just the engine. The airframe had taken damage too. The high-speed dive had bent the left wing spar by 3 degrees. Skin panels along the belly showed micro-tears, stress fractures from G-forces beyond spec. The stabilizer trim was warped. The throttle bracket had fused in place from heat. But the worst math came from the clock. 3 minutes. That was the window. 3 minutes of usable overboost. After that, shutdown or explosion. No middle ground. No repeat mission. No second pass. And that meant no doctrine. Command reviewed the flight log. They saw the speeds, the escape, the fact that 5 Me-262s had been neutralized, not by combat, but by being outmaneuvered in the one place they never expected, the edge of physics. But military doctrine isn't built on one-offs. They needed sustainable tactics, repeatable outcomes, something they could copy, scale, teach. Branson's flight was none of those things. It was a ghost, a moment where the limits bent, but did not break, a mission held together by grease, timing, and desperation. So they buried it. No reprimand, no commendation, just silence. The Mustang was pulled from rotation. The turbo was removed, tagged salvage, experimental, and never tested again. Branson was reassigned to coastal patrol, flying low-risk recon over Allied-held territory. Malley was sent to depot command, told to stick to factory schematics. The message was clear. We don't reward what we can't replicate. But some pilots took notes. They began flying differently. Steeper dives, shorter intercept bursts. Some stripped weight. A few pushed their mechanics for unofficial boost curves. Quietly, A culture of micro-experimentation bloomed in the war's final weeks. Not doctrine, not rebellion, just whispers. Because everyone saw what happened that day over Bavaria, and no one forgot what it meant. The math had collapsed. But the fear it left in the Me-262s, that stayed. April 25, 1945, 11 o'clock hours, JG-7 headquarters, a camouflaged hangar near Parchim Airfield, northern Germany. Oberleutnant Dietrich Kloss stood in front of the chalkboard with a half-lit cigarette and an expression somewhere between confusion and contempt. Behind him, 5 pilots sat slouched, flight suits still reeking of hot oil and cordite. Their Me-262s had landed just an hour earlier. Engines intact, ammo untouched, egos slightly bruised. No one wanted to be here, especially not for a debrief where nothing had been shot down. But something about the mission didn't sit right. "Explain again," Kloss said, tapping a stick on the flight path map. "How does one piston fighter escape 5 jet interceptors? At altitude?" No one answered. Unteroffizier Gunther finally spoke up. "He turned before we expected. Dove too steep. We were still accelerating." Kloss exhaled smoke and muttered, "So, he knew how we fly?" Silence. JG-7. The world's first operational jet fighter wing wasn't used to missing targets. Me-262s didn't chase, they ambushed, intercept, fire, disengage. The aircraft wasn't built for dogfighting, but that mission had turned into something else, a chase, a lesson, an embarrassment. Lieutenant Haller, the most senior flyer in the group, added reluctantly, "He flew differently, as if he expected us to fail the angle, almost baiting us." The words hung in the air. Kloss flipped open the mission log. The radar report showed a visual acquisition window of 22 seconds, long enough for a textbook kill. But nothing lined up. Branson had jinked, climbed, dived again. His turns were erratic but tight. The speed numbers were all wrong. "He broke protocol," Kloss said. "He dove at full power with no attempt to climb. Like he knew we couldn't follow." Another silence. What wasn't said was louder. He did know. He knew their spool-up delay, their minimum arc, their turn bleed. That Mustang had been waiting for jets. JG-7's intelligence officer entered holding a flimsy Allied aircraft profile sheet. He placed it on the table. P-51D Mustang. Nothing new. Likely rogue pilot. Possibly damaged and fleeing. But the pilots weren't convinced. "Rogue pilots don't fly like that," Gunther said. Kloss walked over to the observation window, stared at the runway where 3 262s were being rearmed. The Luftwaffe was losing planes daily. Fuel was rationed. Spare parts were mythical. And now they had a new fear. Allied fighters that acted like jets. He turned back. "Tell command," he said coldly, "to update threat estimates. Allied piston aircraft may be modifying climb behavior, possibly altering engine profiles. The Americans are desperate, and desperation makes them clever." The officer nodded and left. Kloss paused, then said, almost to himself, "If they start thinking like us, we lose our edge." That night, a special briefing was drafted. The term "wild maneuvering Mustang" was added to the next Luftwaffe field bulletin. Pilots were warned, do not assume superiority in speed alone. Watch for early dives, don't follow past red line. Re-engage only after confirming target behavior. It was subtle, but it was the beginning of doubt, because JG-7 hadn't just missed a kill. They'd lost control. And in the war's final weeks, every illusion of invincibility was a liability. April 25th, 1945, 1500 hours. Airbase near Reims, France. The mess tent was unusually quiet, not because there was a shortage of food, the rations had actually improved that week, but because the noise had shifted elsewhere. Toward the Mustang parked at Bay 3, the one with no insignia, no fuel tanks, and a smoking engine that looked like it had flown through hell backwards. 3 other pilots sat watching. 2 had flown with Branson before. 1 hadn't. but had heard enough to feel like he had. "You see it happen?" Lieutenant Kemp finally asked. Captain Darren Burke nodded. "Not all of it, just the start, and the end," which was enough. Burke had been flying 5 miles behind Branson's Vector. Close enough to catch visual, far enough to stay out of trouble. He'd seen the jet formation slicing in from the northeast. 5 silver sparks like metal wasps cutting the sky. "I thought he was toast," Burke said. 5 on 1 at altitude? No terrain, no cover, just sky. But then he dove. Kemp leaned in. "What kind of dive?" "Vertical." Burke paused. "Like unhinged. Like he knew they'd try to follow and couldn't." Lieutenant Hawkins chimed in. "What do you mean, couldn't? Those 262s eat Mustangs for breakfast." Burke nodded. "Exactly. That's what they thought, too." He described it like this. The dive wasn't a reaction. It was a trigger. Branson didn't panic. He initiated, pulled hard, dove like he was playing chicken with the airframe itself. And the jets bit. Too late, too wide. "They couldn't match the angle," Burke said. "They had the power, but not the handling. Their inertia worked against them." He didn't see the middle part, but he saw the end. One peeled off. Another almost stalled. The others just vanished into the haze. But Branson kept flying. Not a turn. Not a loop. Just speed. When Branson landed, the base went still. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. That something had shifted. That one man had done something no one else had dared. Turned escape into doctrine. Sergeant Malley stood by the wing, staring at his creation like a man watching a pet lion return with blood on its mouth. Branson climbed out, legs shaking, hands blistered from gripping the throttle. The CO approached, said nothing. No medal, no reprimand, no speech. He just looked at the Mustang, then at Malley, then back at Branson. "You think that's repeatable?" Branson wiped his forehead. "No, sir. But I'd rather fly that wreck again than go up without it." That night, the whispers spread. About the Mustang that screamed like a jet. About the 5 262s that blinked and missed. About a pilot who outflew the future by betting on chaos. Burke said it best. It wasn't speed that saved him. It was timing, and guts, and a mechanic who stopped reading manuals. In the closing days of April 1945, as the German war machine finally buckled under its own weight, one myth remained airborne, not in propaganda, but in the minds of those who saw what they weren't supposed to believe. A Mustang, flying like a jet, escaping what couldn't be outrun. No camera caught it. No kill confirmed it. But it happened, and the verdict wasn't filed in a report. It was whispered in hangars, briefings, and debriefs, passed down like war talismans. You don't have to outrun the enemy, just his expectation. You don't need more power, just better timing. You don't need a new plane, just one mad mechanic and a reason to gamble. Command buried the mod. Too unstable, too dangerous, unrepeatable. But that wasn't the point. Because for one day, one pilot, and one melted turbo, the Mustang became something else. Not a machine of mass production, not a speck on a logistics chart, but a ghost. A blade formed from desperation, flying on the fumes of a collapsing empire, with just enough reach to scrape the edge of tomorrow and return. The Me-262s kept flying. So did the myths. But something had shifted. In Allied planning rooms, engineers revisited turbocharging theory. In Luftwaffe units, warnings were issued. Unidentified Allied piston aircraft with unpredictable climb-dive profiles. In war diaries, a new phrase appeared. Enemy employed unexpected maneuver. That was all the proof anyone needed. Because war doesn't reward balance sheets. It rewards anomalies, flashes, ghosts. And Branson's plane, that ugly, scorched, turbo-screaming beast, became exactly that. A ghost no one could catch, a warning no one could dismiss, and a verdict nailed shut by the sound 5. Me 262s couldn't forget. The howl of a junkyard turbo, rising like thunder, from a plane that shouldn't exist, flying faster than fear. What if the greatest threat to jet fighters in 1945 was a broken turbo and a mechanic who refused to quit? What if history's clean lines, jets beat props, speed wins wars, were nothing more than assumptions, cracked wide open by a 3-minute dive through thin air? This wasn't about one Mustang. It was about what happens when invention isn't born in labs, but in mud, under pressure, inside machines that shouldn't fly. Because sometimes the enemy isn't faster, just overconfident. And sometimes the hero isn't the best pilot, just the last one to panic. If you made it this far, you're the kind of viewer who knows history isn't written by specs or spreadsheets. It's written in sweat, in smoke, in flight logs scratched with grease pencil notes like, "Don't do this again." Worked once, barely. It howled.